Welcome to the Resilient Performance Podcast. I'm your host, Doug Kachigian, and today I'm joined by Dr. Lisa Pitchford. Dr. Pitchford is an exercise physiologist and research scientist. She started her research career as a student in the Ball State University Human Performance Lab. She became interested in the relationships between exercise and genetics, which led her to pursue her Ph.D. with Dr. Steve Roth at the University of Maryland. She then did a post-doctoral fellowship focused on metabolism at the University of Michigan before taking on her current role as a research scientist at Metabolic Technologies Incorporated in Ames, Iowa. Her scientific expertise ranges from applied human physiology to molecular biology and genetics, and her research in exercise performance, metabolism, and nutrition has spanned human, animal, and cell culture research models. Outside of science, she enjoys running marathons, traveling with her husband, and trying new microbreweries. I was fortunate to stumble upon an article that Dr. Pitchford co-authored called Genetic Influences on Athletic Performance, and when I read the article, it reminded me a lot of David Epstein's book, The Sports Gene. If you recall, David was the first guest that we had here on the podcast, and the sports gene was a little bit of a misnomer in the sense that it suggests that there is a single gene that can predict athletic performance, and David's book was really more about complexity and the timeless relationship between nature and nurture. And similarly, Dr. Pitchford's research article is really more about uncertainty and how little we actually know when it comes to predicting athletic talent and how much science has yet to learn about this complex topic. So I wanted to have a similar conversation to the one that I had with David, but with someone who's researched this issue directly, because I think Dr. Pitchford has some really unique insight when it comes to the subject, and it's really a timely one when you consider that there are quite a few commercial products in the market now that claim to be able to predict athletic talent and tell coaches, athletes, and parents the best way that people should train. And I think the word should is really problematic, especially when there are some really serious ethical considerations involved. And the ethical nature of this conversation was a huge emphasis in Dr. Pitchford's paper. So I think you guys are really going to enjoy the conversation that we had. I want to apologize in advance for the abrupt ending. Towards the end of our conversation, as we were wrapping it up and saying our goodbyes, we experienced some technical difficulties. So I edited out our muffled goodbyes, but we still covered all of the main topics, and really most of Dr. Pitchford's answers remain intact. So the abrupt ending notwithstanding, I hope you enjoy our conversation. Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time to join me. So I was fortunate enough to stumble upon a paper that you co-authored a few years ago called The Genetic Influence on Athletic Performance. And even though it's 5 years old and a lot has changed since then in terms of the current knowledge about the subject, it seems like some of the principles are still the same. So would you mind beginning by talking a little bit about how you became interested in genetics in the first place?
Sure. Thanks for having me. So it's probably most of the scientists that you talk to would answer similarly. I've been interested in science for as long as I can remember. I started college with the plan to go to medical school, but while I was there, I fell in love with physiology, which is the study of how the human body works. So as a course of that, I was particularly interested in exercise physiology, both as a person who enjoys exercise, but also for the way that you can use exercise to test the limits of physiology. And in the process of learning more about exercise physiology and studying exercise physiology, I really started to grow this interest in genetics because there's so much variability between people in their sports performance and their ability to adapt to training and different types of training. And I was just really interested in why that was the case.
Very cool. So this is obviously going to be a very involved question, and we'll try to keep it conceptual, but when you're measuring something, I think it's important to understand how those things are measured, because that sort of helps to define the limits of what specific data can tell you. So, like I said, conceptually, how do researchers in the field go about studying individual gene function, and then, I guess, more difficultly, the interactions between various genes?
Right. So the first part is to make sure that you define what you mean by gene function. So the classic early studies that are really still done that tell us how genes actually function is really done in animal models by either inducing random mutations or inserting a specific genetic sequence or deleting a specific genetic sequence and looking at what happens to the animal as a result. So if I take this gene away, all of a sudden the eye color changes or something like that. But obviously we can't use those techniques to understand human genetics, and we're talking about human genetics here. So even though humans and mice share a ton of genetic information, there are quite obviously a lot of genetic differences. But in humans, we have to do what's called an association study. So there's a few different ways to do this, but essentially we can either look at a specific gene that we think might play a role based on what we know about it from the literature and compare the genetic variants in a group of individuals, whether they be athletes and non-athletes or people with or without a disease, and look at the association that a specific genetic variant plays on that outcome. The other way to do it is to try an unbiased approach where we can look at all of the genetic variants that we know about and compare those all to some outcome that we are interested in. So, for example, muscle strength. We can measure muscle strength in a bunch of people and then look at all of the genetic variants using all of the genetic sequence and see if we can find some of those genes that seem to be particularly associated with strength.
Okay.
Either way, these.
Yeah. Sorry. You can finish.
Either way, these are really tough studies to do. So all the information that we're getting from these are associations. So we're not proving the genetic function based on any of these human studies.
Okay, so then so where I want to go there is, how do people even know, or geneticists, scientists even know where to begin? Because it sounds like you can look at however many, I don't even know how to quantify it, however many genes are involved and proteins in these various type of behaviors. How do people even know, number one, where to start, and then number two, assuming that they found something that they think might be meaningful, if these are generally association studies, how are scientists controlling for all of the confounding variables that can affect the behavior or the outcome measure in question?
So I'll answer the second part first. And for the most part, they're not controlling for those other variables. So when we do a genetic association study, the information that we're really getting is telling us what percentage of the variation is explained by the genetic variant that we've chosen to look at. So what we might learn is that we can explain 2% of the variation in muscle strength based on a specific genotype of a specific gene. But that's really all the information that we get from a candidate gene study. If you do the whole genome version, you can cobble those together and maybe explain a total of 10% or 15% based on 15 or 20 individual variants. So that gives you obviously more information about the types of genes that control that outcome, but it is always going to explain very little in terms of the sorts of performance things that we're talking about.
Okay, and then so as far as, now we're talking about sort of individual genes, which sounds difficult enough. Now how do we study or control for the interactions between various genes? Because it would seem like, very few human behaviors or even health and disease states can be sort of traced back to one gene where, and obviously we're not even talking about environment right now, but it would seem like multiple genes would have to generally interact to produce some of these outcomes. So how much more does trying to account for the interactions between these various genes complicate what someone like you would have to do as a researcher when you study this stuff?
It infinitely complicates it. So I've actually I've personally not tried to study any gene interactions, and I don't know a lot of researchers who do. There's a lot of gene environment interactions where, say, we know that a specific genetic variant might impact the risk for high cholesterol, but if you exercise regularly, that risk is lessened, for example. So those gene environment interactions, we have some information about those types of things. But as far as how genes work together, we're still in that mouse model stage of things where we can maybe change 2 genes in a mouse and see how those interact with each other versus trying to get a lot of that information out of human association studies. Probably the only way to do it right now is using some really sophisticated statistical techniques with the big data sets that we're starting to get now that sequencing entire genomes is possible. But that analysis is way above my pay grade.
Okay, but so that's being done currently, from your understanding.
I think it's starting to become something that people are interested in doing, but it's incredibly complicated and is, especially in the world of sport and fitness, we don't have the researchers with the backgrounds to do as many of those studies as we would probably like to be doing.
Okay, so just to summarize, because I think that like this is sort of where we are right now. You often hear like such and such a gene is associated with performance in an endurance sport. So are people coming to that conclusion, or are researchers coming to that conclusion because they've been able to isolate that gene and determine that based on people that they know who perform well in endurance sports, there's some kind of a correlation between the activity or the presence of that gene and then aerobic performance?
Most of those conclusions are drawn from an association between some metric of performance that's measurable. So for aerobic performance, that's almost always going to be VO2 max. So that's something that we can measure to, a tenth of a milliliter of oxygen, and we can assign everybody a number. So then we could theoretically get 1,000 people, measure all of their VO2 max, and then look at the association between their genetic variant of the gene and their score. What's more often done is those associations are between cases and controls is kind of the medical terms for it. But basically, elite athletes and non-athletes, or elite endurance athletes and elite power athletes, and comparing the allele frequency or the variant frequency between those two groups of people. So we'll say, oh, this genetic variant is really common in elite marathoners and really uncommon in sprinters. So that's where I would say a bulk of the information that we have comes from those types of studies. Okay.
And you make a really important point, because you're saying that we need to be able to correlate these genes with things that we can measure very easily and systematically. So, and you use VO2 max as an example, and I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but even VO2 max, I mean, that's a correlate for performance in, say, the marathon, but, the person who won the gold medal in the marathon doesn't hand over his or her gold medal to the third place person who might have a VO2 max. So would it be fair to say that even when it comes to, performance that we really care about, like whether it's in sport, or even in the arts, measuring physiology is often just a proxy for something that we can measure more directly, and that in a lot of these genetic studies, they aren't directly measuring performance in the sense that they're correlating it with like a run time or a bike time trial, but it's often with like a VO2 max test. And if they are, looking at say runners, they're basically taking people who are already good runners and then saying, okay, what genes do they have relative to people they don't? So can you kind of speak to just how when people are trying to investigate some of this data and be consumers of this data, like what the difference is between performance and correlates for performance? Because oftentimes you hear like such and such a supplement or product, improved VO2 max, as if like that's necessarily what people care about. But is VO2 max or something like VO2 max always indicative of performance and the thing that we really care about?
So if we stick with VO2 max is certainly really important for successful endurance performance. But you're absolutely right. The likelihood that the person who wins the Boston Marathon has the highest VO2 max of everybody running the Boston Marathon it's not that high, because so many other things come into play, especially with an endurance event where you have not only VO2 max, but also running economy and weather and motivation and shoes and anything else that might impact that athlete on that day. So measuring metrics is certainly not the same as measuring, for example, run times, but the ability to use something like a run time, which is also susceptible to a lot of those factors I just mentioned, would limit the number of people that could be studied so dramatically that you wouldn't be able to find any associations at all.
Right. So there's sort of like I don't know if this is the right word, like a logistical or kind of an administrative reason why, for example, in some of these trials, they aren't using something like a running or a biking performance, because it would reduce the number of people who could participate in the study and therefore kind of sort of depower the data at the end of it.
Yeah, it reduces the ability for any one researcher to be able to collect enough data to be able to make one of these inferences. So the only reason we have as much of the VO2 max versus genetics data as we do is because there was a very large set of studies that were done in families, 2-generation families, that were done by Claude Bouchard at Pennington Biomedical Center. And his data gave us a lot of the information that we have about genetic associations in kind of what I'd call normal people. And in order to do studies in athletes, if you think about the logistics of trying to recruit 100 even, which is really not enough people to do a good genetic association study, and so several hundred to 1,000 elite athletes, well, there's not even that many elite athletes to be able to test to make those associations. Okay, so if I was going to summarize that, if we're talking about something like VO2 max, for example, it would seem that to be a high-level endurance athlete, you have to have a certain baseline VO2 max to be able to perform at a high level, but perhaps after a certain point, changes in VO2 max don't necessarily correlate with better performance. But obviously, you can't take somebody who has a VO2 max in the bottom quarter of the population and expect that person to compete at a high level in endurance sport. Could we make a similar type of conclusion for genes, where let's say we have a gene that is somehow correlated with fast twitch muscle fiber composition? You probably have to have that gene present to be able to compete at a high level in the sprint events in track and field. But beyond that, it might not necessarily tell you that much. So does that seem like a fair way of summarizing what you just said? Yeah, that's a pretty good summary. And I will say, though, that that's almost always true. So the gene that I think you might be referring to is almost never observed in power athletes, is almost always observed in power athletes. But there is at least one example of a Spanish long jumper whose name I can't recall now off the top of my head, who has the exact wrong genotype for his events, yet performs very well. So there's always going to be some exceptions.
Wow, that's really interesting. So in terms of our current understanding of genetics, do you think that there's a difference in how we study genes as they pertain to health or a disease state compared to predicting athletic performance? It would seem like they'd be different in the sense that some diseases, at least, perhaps could be traced to a single gene, whereas performance seems much more multifactorial. And I feel like in what we're seeing now is a lot of vendors in particular are maybe kind of utilizing the same thinking that you would when it comes to the relationship between genetics and a disease state, and then trying to extrapolate that to performance. So do you think that we do have to differentiate between health and performance when it comes to researching individual genes?
So I think it depends on the health condition. There certainly are some diseases, so classic ones, muscular dystrophy, cystic fibrosis, that are very clearly linked to a mutation in a single gene. They're they're pretty straightforward. And then there's some other disease states where there's some really strong linkages, the BRCA1, BRCA2 mutations that have been associated with breast and ovarian cancer come to mind. So there's a pretty strong elevation in risk if you have the risk variant of those genes. But then there's multifactorial diseases like obesity is the classic example. That is, there are so many things that contribute to obesity that we are really struggling to identify the genetic variants that result in obesity, even though it's pretty obvious that there's a strong genetic component to obesity. We're just not able to track down where exactly that's coming from, what gene, what combination of genes more realistically. And so athletic performance is, as we kind of touched on a bit, is exactly that same way. It's entirely depending on how you define athletic performance, and it has a lot of components no matter how you define it, but it takes a very different athlete to excel in the marathon versus a powerlifting event. And so there's no good way to do both. And then what's infinitely more complicated is when you start to look at the sports that most people do, which is soccer, basketball, football, where it's hard to even track down a metric for success that can be measured in a team sport like that. So the ability to predict what might improve your football performance is perhaps infinitely more complicated than anything we've discussed so far.
Okay. And so the theme on many of the episodes here tends to be complex systems, and obviously the scientific method is in many ways necessarily reductionist because you're trying to eliminate the influence of context on a particular outcome measure so that you could study one variable. And it seems like, in order to produce a good study when it comes to genetics, you're trying to do the same thing to the extent possible, isolate for the effects of a particular gene, but then, and you want to obviously make sure that it's statistically significant, the findings. So how do we take all these different pieces of information that obviously are devoid of some context just by virtue of the fact that you're trying to create an experimentally sound study? How do we piece these pieces of information together in a way that's clinically meaningful while also sort of not making too many erroneous deductive leaps? I know it's kind of like a timeless philosophical question when it comes to science, but how do people in your field of exercise physiology and genetics researchers because oftentimes I find that the researchers are the most intellectually honest when it comes to their findings. It's the clinical people or the lay people or even the media who take those findings out of context. So how do you kind of navigate that complexity as a researcher?
So again, I think I'll start with the end, and that it is common that when scientific findings are translated into information for lay audiences, that in the process of distilling that information down for those audiences, that a lot of the uncertainty is removed from that. So if you're going to write an article for the New York Times, you're going to have to take out a lot of the background uncertainty that would be more evident if you're reading the scientific paper, perhaps. But it's really tough to try to take all of these little tiny pieces and turn them into something that's actually usable. And it's been, I think, a lot harder than geneticists expected it to be. We kind of expected for the first human genome to be sequenced and that we would then be able to just go in and find all of the answers without too much trouble, which was incredibly naive. But what we've got is a few, and really it's just a few genetic variants that we are somewhat confident account for maybe 1 or 2% of the variation in things like muscle performance, strength, power. And that other 98, 99% is determined by a lot of things. And probably 50% of those things are genetic, 50% aren't. So we can take those out of our kind of genetic, our genetic pool. But in order to turn those little 1% into an outcome, there have been some attempts to kind of make an index or a set of variants and then calculate a score based on that. And there's really been very little of it in the scientific literature, so I can't say for certain whether that's been particularly successful. I can say that an attempt to create a ideal athlete score has not been successful. In order to, basically, of 21 genes purported to be associated with athletic performance, it's so infinitely unlikely that anybody would have all of those genes that's clearly not the key to elite performance, if that makes sense.
No, totally. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about your paper that I'll post in the notes was it was more of a commentary. So you talked quite extensively about some of the ethical considerations associated with genetic monitoring in sports. And there are a lot of products now that are particularly marketed towards children for the purpose of, or presumably the purpose of, talent identification. And I think the implication is that these tests will tell children or parents or coaches how these youth athletes should train, which is sort of a paternalistic term, and suggests that genetics is destiny, and that even if people have a particular genetic profile, that like for example, somebody who might test well with one of these products for having a genetic profile more conducive to endurance activities, but perhaps that child enjoys sprinting and sports that are played at higher velocities more. But now you've got a coach or a parent saying, well, according to your genetic test, you should be training to do cross country or something you don't really enjoy. So what sort of commentary do you have for parents and just consumers of these products about how to navigate some of the ethical considerations when it comes to this stuff? Because I feel like it'd be one thing if these tests were really, really predictive of athletic performance, but in many ways, just because, you gave the example of that one, if it was a long jumper or a triple jumper, who had the exact opposite of what the normal profile was for success in his sport and still competed at a very high level. So there's this presumption that just because you have these particular genetic markers that you're going to perform at a high level, but they're not necessarily guarantees you're going to go to the Olympics for something. And at the same time, just because, even if they were, that doesn't necessarily mean that that child should be choosing a life in pursuit of a particular sport. So I know that you talked about it extensively in your paper, but how do you go about, just getting into the ethics of some of this stuff?
So that's a big question, and was really our motivation for writing that paper. We felt really strongly about the ethical issues surrounding these types of testing, and particularly when they're marketed to children. And they really go far beyond the performance tests. So to answer your question specifically, for the way I see it, if you have a child who likes sprinting, which honestly is 99% of children, no children like distance running, or very few.
Right.
But if they're not passionate about the sport that their genetics has supposedly assigned them to, their overall chances of success are pretty poor anyway. So, there's a certain amount of practice and drive that is required to compete at the highest levels of any sport. And also, the other concern with that situation is that if this was the parents' idea, which it most likely was, that if the parents are discouraged from promoting the activity that the child already enjoys, that could so easily turn into the child just not doing anything, which as a society, we already have enough trouble with getting kids to be active to the extent that they probably should. So I wouldn't want to do anything to restrict the options for our kids or ourselves to be active in whatever way kind of suits us, whether it's appropriate based on our genetic profile or not. The other big potential ethical issue I see with testing kids is kind of outside of the physical and more emotional. And if you can imagine, if you have a kid who's born into a football family, and even though we can't test for this, but they don't have the quote-unquote right genetics for football, even if that kind of test was available and perfect, finding out that your genetics don't line up with your parents' hopes or expectations could be incredibly devastating for a young child. And I think that one of the major problems with the marketing of some of these types of tests is that parents are really led to believe that you can match your children to the right type of activity, and there's just not any evidence to support that whatsoever.
No, that's a really important point. And the other thing is sometimes the same product is being marketed towards youth athletes and professionals, with the idea again being that these genetic profiles can tell you the quote unquote best way to train. And to me, if these products do have value, they would seem to have more value at the youth level, some of the ethical considerations aside. But what would be the value of some of these products at the elite level, where it would seem to me like a lot of these athletes have already essentially been genetically screened and selected because they're already in pro sports or Olympic sports? So once you're at that level, how much is a genetic test really going to tell you about how you should be training or about your potential? Because presumably you've already reached your potential to a large degree. So do you see a difference in the application of some of these products once they do become more sophisticated as they pertain to youth athletes compared to higher level or professional athletes?
Yeah, so I really think that the most logical, even though I have some ethical concerns about it, place to apply these is in young children, because you can't test other potential metrics of performance. So really the only information that you have is maybe these genetic predispositions. But I also know that these types of tests, whether they're the specific consumerly or commercially available tests or other types of analyses, are being used by all sorts of professional sports teams and high caliber athletes. And there's two theoretical avenues for that. The first is to use genetic information to select the best of the best if you're a coach or something like that. But there's really not any evidence to suggest that a generic variant or even a combination of several genetic variants is going to give you any more information than, say, a 40-yard dash for a football player. So I can't see any actual utility of that at all. So I think that the idea is that the genetic information might be able to be used to personalize training prescriptions, either to maximize performance improvements or potentially to reduce injury. So that makes sense as a goal. I'll, I guess, explain the injury a bit more. So if you have a genetic predisposition towards, say, a tendon injury, maybe as a result of that genetic variant, you're prescribed fewer reps at practice. But the same thing is still sort of true, is that I'm not aware of any evidence supporting the efficacy of doing that. And if you're prone to tendon injuries as a professional athlete, I doubt that either you, your coaches, or the athletic trainers need a genetic test to tell them that information. So I think that the goal is that these little pieces of information will help us optimize our training. But if that is to be the case, we're just not there yet.
Right, and presumably if you did identify a genetic predisposition for something like tendon injuries, predisposition just means that you're more likely to have it, relative to somebody else, but it doesn't mean that you can't train your tendons to adapt to the stresses of your sport and sort of overcome that as well. Maybe you're just kind of starting a little bit in the hole or behind the starting line compared to somebody else with a more favorable genetic profile. So I think I'm really happy to hear you say that we're not there yet, because what I really want people to take away from this is how to have a filter when it comes to evaluating some of these products, whether you're a coach or a parent or even just a recreational athlete. So I think you've summarized it pretty well. But is there anything else you want to add as far as how to, when it comes to any sort of product that's using science to make some kind of a claim, how just the layperson can better evaluate some of these products and be more informed consumers?
That's really tough. There are a few issues that I would say plague most of the products that I'm aware of right now. I would say that all of them are exaggerating the claims. So they're these claims of benefits that aren't supported by enough evidence to be accepted by the scientific community, but there's just enough evidence to have a citation to put it in your test. And so the claims aren't as strong as I think perhaps they're being made. And then a big issue with certainly not every product that's on the market, but a lot of them is a lack of disclosure. So a 2015 study looked at that time there were 39 companies that had genetic testing services that were marketed towards either sports or fitness or something like that. And about half of them didn't say what genes or markers were being used to make the conclusions and interpretations that they were giving the customer. And in that situation, it is literally impossible for anybody, whether that person be the consumer or an academic or a physician, to evaluate those claims when they don't have access to the information that they're based on. So that, I think, is a major issue if you were going to go down the road of doing this genetic testing because you think it is the right choice for you. I would certainly steer people to those companies who do disclose, on what basis they're making their claims, so that as the scientific field advances, that you can kind of still check in and see whether these things hold up, or sometimes things are disproven later as more studies are done.
All right, understood. And then you did your particular article, I think it was about 5 years ago. So what's changed in terms of the understanding of genetics since you wrote your paper, and what's the current emphasis among sports genetics researchers now, would you say?
So I think that perhaps maybe not since we wrote our paper, but maybe around the time that we were writing it, is what was changing was the amount of rigor that was expected in genetic studies. So a lot of the early studies just had way too few people to make really solid even associations. And so again, they're not causative, but the associations were often unable to be replicated in other cohorts. And so that's not that surprising now that we know a lot more about the effects of the environment and, these gene-gene interactions that we really don't have a great understanding of. And so the newer genetic studies, there are considerably fewer of them that are well-designed because they're hard to do. They're very expensive to do. And so you're seeing fewer studies published, but I think that people are gearing up to do better studies in this area. So costs are coming down dramatically. So in terms of being able to sequence and run genetic tests, and there's some support now for these types of projects through a new initiative that the National Institutes of Health has launched and isn't really up and running yet, but it's a pretty good sum of money that's dedicated to studying the biology of exercise, and it's being very well controlled on a large group of people. And importantly, all of that data is going to be made available to researchers in a de-identified way in a central place. And so there's some excitement for the ability to use that good quality performance, even though it'll still be these metrics, data to do larger, good quality studies. So I think that things are changing, and we're moving away from those candidate gene studies to more of those whole genome studies, and trying to really increase the number of people that are being studied in attempts to do high quality studies instead of these little projects that often are contradicted the next time that they're looked at.
Okay. And I mean, obviously people like you and I are passionate about things like sports medicine and exercise physiology, but within the field of genetics as a whole, I would suspect that in terms of the the incentives for a researcher, there are more incentives to study things like, cancer prevention and prediction compared to like which, 4-year-old is going to run the best 100-meter time when he or she is 16 or 17 years old. So do you find that people who are interested in this very specific area of genetics research have a harder time maybe, procuring funding and things like that, just because it probably isn't considered as important and consequential in the grand scheme of genetics research as a whole?
Yeah, I would say that there's an incredibly limited amount of funding for studying the genetics of elite athletic performance, because a lot of the funding for genetic studies in general is coming from the NIH, and they have a mission to improve public health, and improving the 100-meter time of 4 or 5 athletes is frankly just not really that critical for public health. And so there's certainly much more funding going towards studies that are focusing on health outcomes